Thank you all for coming to College of Social and Behavioral Sciences' second downtown lecture series on happiness. We're really happy to see everyone here. Awesome. You know, I said last week that a vibrant city requires a vibrant hub for culture and intellectual activity. And last week we provided that with Celestino Fernandez, and then everyone in the audience went out and from the remarks I got back from proprietors all over downtown, you guys did the culture thing. Thank you very much. Celestino spoke about systematic variation in happiness as it crosses axes of individual identity, including life course and race and gender, and also social context, and also how happiness has changed over time or not. Tonight, Dr. Charles Chuck Raison is going to talk to us about the individual, social, and biological processes and how they intersect to determine our happiness, and we're very pleased to have him with us. Before I introduce him, I'd like to thank the Fox Theater for, again, hosting us in this magnificent facility. The Arizona Public Media, I want to thank for live streaming this event throughout the world, really, but also at our overflow facility, which I understand is completely full. And so a shout out to our colleagues at TEP and Unisource Energy. They've been great to work with in taking the people that we weren't able to fit into the Fox. We have a number of lead sponsors, 3 lead sponsors, without which we wouldn't be able to do the kind of community outreach that is taking place here tonight, and that is Tucson Medical Center, the Arizona Daily Star, and the college's Magellan Circle. Thanks to all of you. There's a large number of community sponsors and partners who have helped us, those providing financial contributions. I first want to give a warm thank you to Chef Janos Wilder of Downtown Kitchen and Cocktails, who sponsored last week's reception, and who in my nervousness, I get nervous in front of 18-year-old freshmen. In my nervousness, I forgot to thank. Thank you, Janos. Also, Miraval, Arizona Resort and Spa, the EOS Foundation, the Path to Happiness, and I'd also like to thank from the U of A, the Institute of the Environment, the Center for the Philosophy of Freedom, the Department of Philosophy, and 2 good friends of mine who have helped me negotiate the downtown real estate market, Vicki Jacobs and Diana Tolton of Tierra Antigua Realty. So thank all of you. I think you're going to really enjoy yourself tonight. Dr. Chuck Raison is a medical doctor with a liberal arts background. He has a degree in anthropology from Stanford University, so I wonder if there's a pattern building here. He also has a master's in English, actually with a concentration in creative writing from the University of Denver, and he did his medical degree at Washington University in St. Louis, and his residency at UCLA, and also worked at UCLA after his residency. He then moved and spent about a dozen years at Emory University in Atlanta, and he came to the University of Arizona in 2011, where he joined the College of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry, and he also holds a joint appointment in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Norton School of Family and Consumer Sciences. Chuck's work has largely been directed to the sort of other side of happiness, and that is the side, of course, of depression. Most of his work has been aimed at understanding both the proximate causes of depression, such as illness or stress, but also how that interacts, or how those factors interact with more foundational aspects of depression and sadness, such as we might find in our evolutionary makeup or in biological processes or in our genetic makeup. His work and the work of his team has been aimed at trying to understand how to relieve mood issues that people face and the anxieties that people face. And to do that, he's looked at individual behaviors and how we can change them, the social context within which we operate, the patterns of self-reflection and self-realization and self-assessment that come under the processes of meditation. And he is a medical doctor, so obviously also one of my own favorites is the role that psychotropic drugs can have on enhancing our happiness. Tonight, he's going to focus on that aspect of self-awareness. He's been a leader in the development of something called cognitively based compassion training, and that's what we'll hear mostly about tonight. I also want to mention a few other things that Chuck works on with David Reichlen, who is in the School of Anthropology. He'll be joining us in a couple of weeks to talk about exercise and happiness, partly as a result of the activities that we've been involved with in putting this lecture series together. They have embarked on a project to determine whether or not you get more happiness from running in sneakers or running barefoot. Chuck is also working on a project in what is called hyperthermia, which is a question as to whether or not changing our body temperature can relieve depression. But my all-time favorite in looking through his CV and the articles on it is the question of whether or not the moon, a full moon in particular, really can make you crazy. And the answer is sort of yes, but probably not the way that you thought. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Chuck Raison.
Now? Okay. Thank you, sir. Oh, good evening, everybody. I'm not going to be seduced into talking about cooking depressed people or running barefoot, but I do want to talk about compassion training. And so I'll let him grab this mic. There's a paradox deep in the heart of happiness, and it's that paradox I want to talk to you tonight. You know, we think of happiness as something that is primarily an individual pursuit. You can hear it in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, culture or society is seen as a background or a sort of a support in which all individuals have a chance to chase after happiness by themselves. And bookshelves, of course, you know, just go down to any bookstore, whatever bookstores are left in the world, and you can see shelf after shelf of books about how to achieve happiness, as if it's something that the individual can chase after that way. And you know, that's not exactly untrue, but I want to suggest to you, and this is one of the core concepts behind the compassion training I'm going to talk to you about tonight. I want to suggest to you that it's not really true. There's a deeper truth about happiness, and it's this. You know, there are innumerable studies, and we've known this from the wisdom tradition for thousands of years, that in fact, the most effective way to secure happiness for yourself is actually to work for the happiness of others. And that is the great paradox of happiness, that the best way to pursue it for yourself is actually not always to focus on chasing it for yourself. I did not really understand this until I heard the Dalai Lama say it a number of years ago, and this is the only quote I'm going to read tonight, but he often says this in variations of this. I often joke half sincerely and half seriously, saying that if we wish to be truly selfish, we should be wisely selfish rather than foolishly selfish. Our intelligence can help to adjust our attitude in this respect. If we use it well, we can gain insight as to how we can fulfill our own self-interest by leading a compassionate way of life. And I can't think that would be a good end of this talk as well as a good beginning, because that is the essence of what I want to talk to you about tonight, and it's the essence of what we have been trying to develop and trying to study. Now, sounds good, sounds inspiring, but we all know it ain't so easy. If it was easy, I wouldn't have to be up here talking about it. We'd all just be out doing it. It wouldn't even be interesting. So we know that it's hard for human beings, even if they intellectually believe, and even if they could read data that people that help others, that are pro-social, are happier, more fulfilled, more successful. There's something about us that struggles with that, and I want to suggest to you there's a number of reasons. I'm going to focus on one tonight, and it has to do with the fact that we didn't fall out of the sky as blank slates. My two little 4.5-year-olds are here, and they sort of think they came to the world on a pirate ship, but it's not actually true. We have a very long history, and we have a very particular kind of history, and it's got some beauties and it's got some warts. But I want to suggest to you that as we think about compassion and how to integrate compassion into happiness, we should remember what the philosopher George Santayana said, that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And we have a past, certain elements of which make it hard for us to achieve this idea of compassion. Now, JP talked about cytokines and the fact that I've spent a long time studying the immune system, and one of the things that's taught me, and it really changed the way I think about being a psychiatrist, is that many of the deepest things we are very, very ancient. So some of the immune chemicals that I'm going to talk about briefly tonight, they, as far as we can tell, they go back to the beginning of life. They are essentially the same in single-celled organisms, and they greatly impact how we think and feel. So here's 4.5 billion years of the Earth's history, and you see the arrow, and not the big blue bar, let me see if I can show you, not this one, but you see that little bitty sliver there? That is the history, not of Homo sapiens, but of hominids on Earth. If you take that little blue line and break it down, it looks like this, and we as a species occupy this. So we have a very long history. You know, they test antidepressant drugs in mice and rats. They can do that because mice and rats are wired an awful lot like us. How else could you ever use animal models, right? We separated off from the rodents 60 million years ago. So a lot of our past is ancient, and a lot of that past has aspects of it that make compassion difficult. I want to just focus on the past, say, of the last million years or so, really the human past. So really just sort of yesterday. And if this was a different kind of talk and I was being more upbeat in this part of the talk, I'd say that, in fact, one of the great secrets, I believe, to recovering or to achieving happiness in the modern world, in addition to what we're going to talk about, compassion, is to try to recuperate or recover some of our evolved strengths that we've sort of lost track of in many ways in the modern world, and that we know produce well-being, and that, in fact, are the topics of a couple of our next talks. So we know, for instance, that humans evolved to be super social species, and that still today, having strong, deeply felt, supportive interpersonal connections is probably the single strongest factor that produces happiness in human beings, and it's been that way, for probably 1 million years. We know that certain patterns of eating and certain ways of exercising, a la Dave Reichland in a couple of weeks, produce happiness in contradistinction to the sedentary, kind of dismal food that many of us eat most of the time. And we know that humans evolved in certain natural environments, and exposure to certain natural environments can have healing effects. Esther Sternberg's going to talk about that. And then we know, in fact, that we have very complex relationships with the microbial world that have been profoundly disrupted in the modern world, and that, if restored, might produce happiness. So these are good factors in the evolutionary balance from our past. But alas, of course, we inherit some bad things. And by bad, I mean things that cause us misery and trouble in the modern world. And the one I want to focus on tonight, I first learned about from the anthropologist Evans Pritchard, who studied tribes in sub-Saharan Africa. And he noticed that when times were rough, huge groups of people. These were real tribal societies, little clans, little families, very much closer to the way humans evolved than the way we live today. That when times were rough, they would all clump together and cooperate, and everybody would get along pretty much. And then when the rainy season came and there was plenty of food and stuff, people would start breaking apart. They'd start fighting because they didn't need each other anymore. And he called this segmentalism, the tendency of human beings to break off into smaller and smaller and smaller groups that fight with each other. In groups, out groups. Something that I've recently started calling the tribal mind. This inherent tendency of human beings to see some people as being good, some people as being on the inside, some people as being like us, and other people as being problematic, troublesome, not like us, foreign, not fully human. In many hunter-gatherer societies, there's one word that means people of our tribe, and that's the word for human beings, and there's another word that doesn't mean human for other people. And because this is such a deeply, deeply rooted hominid tendency, we have a physiology to go along with it. We have a brain and body that evolved not just for cooperation and for caring, but also for conflict and for being able to cope with this sort of the chronic stress that comes from living in a world of us against them, our little group against your little group. And these are factors that impede our ability to heed the Dalai Lama's advice. They're factors in our brain and body that tend to make us unable to really engage in compassion. And in fact, this is a direct quote from Jared Diamond from his book, which is kind of thick going, called The World Until Yesterday, all about how the world, the sort of traditional world of humans. And he says, small-scale societies divided people into three categories: friends, enemies, and strangers. Compassion training, although secular, derives from Tibetan Buddhism. And in the Buddhist tradition, there are three poisons. And those poisons are desire, avarice, aversion, hatred, dislike, and ignorance. But they're often described as breaking the world into friends, enemies, and strangers. That which we like, that which we dislike, and that which we ignore. And so it's remarkable that this is something that sort of every society on earth, every human being tends to frame the world this way. And Jared Diamond has this great story following this sentence where he talks about the fact that traditionally, if two people from, say, small hunter-gatherer societies were kind of roaming around and two strangers bumped into each other, if they couldn't escape and they had to sit down together, they would begin very often a many-hour discussion trying to figure out if they had any relatives in common. They would name everybody they were related to, all the clans. And if they couldn't find somebody that they shared in common as a relative, as Jared Diamond says, they couldn't just get up and say, "Have a nice day." They'd have to try to kill each other. Now, we think, oh, well, that was a long time ago. But in fact, I don't need to tell you that this tendency that we have to divide into good guy, bad guy, in, out, friend, stranger, friend, foe, is wreaked havoc on our world, and you can see it on every level. Certainly you can see it internationally. I don't need to tell you that you can see it nationally, right? We don't need to rehearse this. And of course, these guys suffer. I know that they don't get much sleep at night, but we suffer too, right? Stock market, we seem to have dodged it this time. The last time that happened, that's what happened to the stock market, right? A lot of people were hurt in this country by that enmity. And of course, this is not something that we start doing when we're adults, right? This goes all the way back to the playground. And in fact, in many ways, it's at its most terrible and painful in the playground, where you're stuck in a class and there's no escape and everything seems so real and so inescapable. This is a very, very deeply hardwired human tendency that is a tremendous source of misery. Now, you take it to its extreme and you break things down far enough, and within the sort of larger society of the family, you get the tribe of the individual. And God knows that this accounts for a lot of misery in the world. And it really is true that the self is the smallest tribe, right? So this tendency, this segmentalizing tendency that at the end of the day turns into every man and woman for himself, is directly in opposition to this idea that if we want to achieve maximal happiness, based on what we know now from the scientific literature, we need to somehow overcome that tendency and reframe our thinking so that we begin to see ourselves somehow not as in conflict with everybody or not as separated, but not in just some fancy language way, but in some daily activity way, as interconnected with others in a way such that their benefit generally produces my benefit. And even if I'm not trying to be a Buddha or to be enlightened, if I just want my own best shot at personal happiness, that realignment of perception, that's the challenge. So it's a challenge, but I think we can say this, that it's always been true, but it's never been truer than today, that enemies are expensive. One of the times when I was sort of semi-alone with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, he said, wars, they were okay in the old days, I mean, they're bad, people died, but, maybe they served a purpose. The problem in the modern world is they don't serve a purpose anymore. We have to overcome these tendencies or we're going to blow ourselves to bits. Pretty impressive coming from him. Enemies are expensive. And so if we want to try to deal with this problem, if we want to try to neutralize our enemies, to put them on ice, to overcome this problem, recognizing that this tendency to identify enemies is a real source of human unhappiness, you'd probably agree with me that the first thing to do is to figure out who the enemy is, right? I mean, if you're going to fight a war, if you are going to take on an enemy, you better figure out who your enemy is. And so the first thing we want to ask ourselves, if we're going to begin to try to untangle this, is who's the real enemy? So it turns out that enemies are a lot slipperier, or more slippery, than they appear on first glance. So for instance, consider this. Here we see an old Confederate soldier with a cranky old Union soldier. This is a picture taken in the early years of the 20th century. And it's not a widely known fact, but Civil War reenactments didn't start in the 1980s or the 1990s. They started in the late 1860s and 1870s. But the difference was in those days, the reenactments were done by the soldiers themselves, right? The old Confederate guys would get together and they would, try to redo Pickett's charge, and the Union guys, and then they'd discuss, what really happened. And over the years, of course, as time went on, more and more of the soldiers died. And one of the final celebrations they had in Washington, D.C. in the early years of the 20th century, they wanted to put together a brigade, but there weren't enough Union soldiers to put together a brigade, and there weren't enough Confederate soldiers to put together a brigade. So these gentlemen, now old and decrepit, who had spent a number of years earnestly trying to kill each other as young men, gathered and marched together in one unit, reflecting what T.S. Eliot said, that what we've taken from the winners, or what we've received from the winners, we've taken from the vanquished, and they're all now folded into one constitution of silence. People that start out as enemies often end up as almost as odd sorts of people who love each other. So this fact that enemies can be healing has not been lost on people that have been working with Vietnam vets. And one of the really successful programs over the last number of years has been to take American Vietnam vets that have really serious post-traumatic stress disorder and take them back to Vietnam and have them meet with the Viet Cong. And I really like this picture because here are these two guys, 30, 40 years ago, they would have hated each other. They would have been desperately trying to kill each other. They would have killed each other on sight very often. But look at their faces. These are not two guys that are saying, hey, nice to meet you. These are two guys who are profoundly moved. These are two guys who love each other. And the funny thing about enemies, and you can see this on the playground too, is that very often enemies can shift into lovers. Think about how many movie plots start with the man and the woman fighting with each other, right? Think about your early love life. You don't have to provide me with the details, but just think about that woman or man that you loved so much, you were so in love with, and if it didn't work out, ask yourself, did they look the same at the beginning as they did at the end, right? This is not rocket science. It's just common practical sense, but it really points to something important, which is we do not want to make light of the fact that we have to struggle in this world, and we do not want to make light of the fact that there are some people that do really bad things, and there are people that would certainly hurt us, and they're really, in that sort of pragmatic sense, of course there's enemies. But I want to suggest to you that especially in the struggle for happiness, our real enemies are not the people who oppose us. Our real enemies are the anger and the hatred that we feel towards these people. Because it's these feelings, it's these negative emotions that are engendered in us when we enter into these conflictual relationships that ruin our happiness. And as Shantideva, the great Buddhist sage of sort of the late Middle Ages, said, these enemies are ruthless. They never change. Anger and hatred never change. They never let up. They never benefit us. And they're relentless. Unlike human enemies, today they're an enemy, tomorrow they're a friend. Today they're a friend, tomorrow they're an enemy. These negative emotional states are unrelenting, and we know now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Buddhists were righter than we were about this, that in the West we sort of had a tendency, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, to sort of valorize people that were full of passionate anger and these complex emotions. As a psychiatrist, as somebody that studies the brain and the body and what produces health and what produces disease, we know for a fact now that anger, hostility, pessimism, and then things that go along with those angry states, depression, anxiety, all those negative emotional states really are poison, and they are very large predictors of a lot of things that are really bad. Heart disease, depression and anger are as big a predictor of having a heart attack as smoking a couple of packs of cigarettes. There's been discussion for years of adding depression on as a known cardiac risk factor, and the American Cardiology Association has resisted, but the data are incontrovertible. Anger, hostility, depression are big predictors of obesity. They're predictors of diabetes. They're predictors of cancer. If you keep anger in, you tend to get cancer. If you let anger out, you tend to get heart disease. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Dementia, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and of course, what I study, major depression. So these negative states really are enemies, and of course, there's the small point that if we can't get a hold of ourselves, we may blow ourselves to kingdom come, to boot, right? That how we deal with our enemies on every level is one of the major challenges, along with certain, I think, environmental issues, one of the major challenges to our survival as a species in the 21st century. So this isn't just about mental well-being, it really is about how are we going to think about beginning to try to restructure our world so that we have a better chance of pulling through. And so, that's way beyond what I do, but I do study inflammation, and I study how the brain and the body talk to each other. And it became very clear to me, the stuff I'm telling you now became very clear to me that through the research, that all these negative emotions produce these bad health risks. And so about 12, 14 years ago, we began to ask ourselves, could we identify novel strategies for reducing these sorts of anger, hatred, negative feelings, and then things that go along with them, like having these sort of overly unrealistic feelings of rejection and defeat, and just in general, this sort of constellation of negativity, all of which really destroy happiness. And of course, there's a lot of things one could do to take this up. It just happens that it's been my good fortune in life to have this long, ongoing relationship with the Tibetan Buddhist world. And because of that relationship, I knew that there was this line of practice within Tibetan Buddhism that's known as lojong, and basically, which means mind training, this extremely rigorous way of trying to reshape how you perceive the world, and to reshape it from seeing the world as a place of sort of conflict and competition to a place of cooperation and potential win-win scenarios. That's a secular way of saying it, and that's really what we're trying to achieve. We're not trying to help people become Buddhas necessarily, but just to reframe the world so that the social world doesn't look so dangerous. So we decided to embark upon trying to study this type of meditation. I put this picture up. We got a lot of inspiration from His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, but the gentleman on my right, or on my left, your right, Geshe Lobsang Tenzin Negi, is my very, very dear friend and collaborator. We've worked together for years. He is in the Department of Religion at Emory in Atlanta and is the spiritual director of something called the Drepung Losling monastery, and he's also the head of the Emory-Tibet Partnership, which is something we created now a number of years ago to try to facilitate this discussion between Tibetan wisdom and the modern world. So he and I decided that we were going to try to take this vast, several thousand-year-old corpus of meditative wisdom and somehow try to secularize it and boil it down and turn it into something that could be taught to folks with a specific purpose, again, not of trying to help them achieve enlightenment, but of trying to help them develop ways of looking at the world that enhance their feelings of positive social connectivity and thereby enhance their physical health. So we call it CBCT. Why do we call it CBCT? Because we felt like we had to have an acronym, some sort of fancy name. We thought compassion meditation sounded a little bit maybe dodgy. So, there's MBCT and CBT and DBT and ACT. You got to have a T and you got to have a C and you got to have letters. So I can't remember what I wanted to call it. This was what Geshe Lobsang ended up with, because it's not just cognitive, but we call it cognitively based because unlike other meditative practices, it has a differential emphasis on thinking while you're meditating and reasoning with yourself about why you feel the way you do about the world. We taught it, the first time we did it for 6 weeks. Why did we do it for 6 weeks? Because as I'll show you, we were studying college kids and we had 6 weeks, right? Those beggars can't be choosers. When we do children, and I'll show you some data on that in a little bit, we like to do it in 12 weeks. But generally we do it in 8 weeks because, I don't know, it just decided a nice round number, and other meditation things do it in 8 weeks, and it's not enough, but it's reasonable. So what do? It's got a number of elements. The first two elements it shares in common with really almost every meditative practice, which is first learning to develop attentional stability. The word here is shamatha. But it really means being able to develop a real pliancy in your attention so that when you focus on something, you can keep it focused. And if you've ever tried to meditate, you know that when you start, you can do that for about 3 or 4 seconds and then you're gone. And that's the first time you try. I'm down to like 1 or 2 seconds after the second or third episode, often before I then fall asleep, unfortunately. Those that can't do meditation, study meditation, right? And then the second element is something that's referred to as vipassana mindfulness. And that has the flavor of learning to be observant of what's going on in your head, what's going on in your world, without clinging on to your thoughts, recognizing that thoughts are thoughts, letting them go. Neither judging them, nor fixating on them, nor suppressing them, but having this sort of open, curious attitude and beginning to realize that your brain is spinning out all this stuff all the time, and it's not reality. So once that's in place to some degree, we begin the remainder of it, which is really about specific compassion. And I can't go in tonight, given time constraints, on the specific methodologies, but first we work on self-compassion, and this is interesting. Geshe Lobsang did not have this in our original version because Tibetans don't have a word for this. And when the Dalai Lama first learned that there were people that hated themselves, he flat out refused to believe it. You can hear it. It's in this scientific dialogue. He said, not possible. Not possible, And now he knows it's possible. For the Western world, you've got to introduce self-compassion. Our take on self-compassion is a little different. We try to focus on the fact that our own negative thoughts and feelings are damaging us, and that we can overcome our own, and because of that, we can help other people overcome theirs. So it's a little bit of a different spin. Then we work on this thing I'm going to talk about at a little bit of length called equanimity. And then it shifts into working on develop affectionate love and empathy. First for people that you feel it for naturally, and then attempting to gradually extend it next to people that are strangers, and finally to people that you don't like, that you can't stand, that drive you crazy, the people you're competing with at work that you'd like to put a little knife in their back. You have to practice wishing them well and hoping they get all their achievements and everything succeeds for them. Someday we're going to do a study where we look at people's stress system when they're doing that part of the meditation. I'm convinced it's a stressor. And then the final aspect is attempting to convert these internal sort of exercises into a sort of an external a commitment to external compassion, to actually trying to help people. That is what it is. But I want to try to give you a flavor of its two main elements, one of which is equanimity, and the other of which is empathy. Now, what I'm going to show you is not part of CBCT. I'm just trying to give you a little flavor for it. I wouldn't presume to run you through a CBCT exercise, but I do think I can try to give you a little bit of a flavor for equanimity. So equanimity, in this context means trying to smooth out what I've already referred to as this instinctual tendency to immediately identify not just people, but really everything into the category of good, bad, and who cares. Like, don't like, and whatever, right? And in fact, that tendency, this is one place where Buddhism lines up remarkably well with evolutionary theory. Because, from an evolutionary perspective, you could almost define life as living organisms are complex entities that under their own steam can approach that which benefits them, retreat, and plants have their own ways of retreat from that which poses a threat, and ignore everything that you don't think is relevant to your survival and reproduction, right? That's the engine that turns life, and in the Buddhist world, those are the three kleshas, the three poisons. So equanimity is about recognizing that the things that you value, you overvalue, the things that you devalue, you underestimate, and the things that you ignore are really often your greatest potential source of benefit. That's really what it is. So it's not about becoming some sort of flat emotion zombie. It's really about sort of recognizing the folly of how we tend to look at things. And cutting yourself some slack, because after all, we're only human beings. We evolved to see the world through the eyes of our own reproductive and survival needs, but it is a true scientific fact that puts a certain type of colored glasses on our eyes. And we all know, if you think about it for a minute, that the world's not really like that. So one of the ways of thinking about what equanimity is about is that it's really the attempt to see the world more as it really is, as it would be if you could get everybody's perspective on it all at once. So just let me give you an example. So let's think about things that we overvalue. Here's something I overvalue. I wish I had this painting, actually. It's by a friend of mine who lives in this little small town out in the countryside of California that I come from. And he's a plein air painter, and he paints these very romantic scenes of the farming life that I grew up in and that I am still very wistful about. And, even if you're not a farmer, we'd all agree that this is a bucolic scene, right? All right, so this is, when I wander around thinking about my hometown, this is how I think about it. I've got a cousin who's actually in the photography school up at ASU, who's one of these realistic kind of guys, right? So he tracked the house down. So there's overvaluing. Now, let me get real serious with you for a second, and forgive me, but I want you folks to do a thought experiment that's disturbing. All right, now I'm serious about this, because I want you to look at this baby, and I want you to imagine that you've been given a job, and the job is that you have to go up with a gun and shoot this baby in the head at point-blank range. Now, that makes you feel terrible, right, doesn't it? I heard it in the crowd. Sorry, I don't mean to be a bummer. If you had to do that, would you feel like this? You did. The baby was bin Laden. Now, CBCT and this line of thought does not say you shouldn't go kill bin Laden. That's not the point, right? And in fact, if you knew that bin Laden as a baby, if you had perfect insight into the future and you knew what was going to happen, maybe you'd actually think about killing him, right? I mean, you could spare many, many lives, but you would not do it this way, right? And that is, to me, and again, this is not part of CBCT, this is Raison sort of, having worked with it for years. This is trying to get at the essence of it. Yes, of course you're going to have conflicts, but when you begin to see that everybody is like you in wanting to be happy, in wanting to be free from suffering, and is doing what they do because they have no choice or because they're ignorant or they don't understand, and that you do it for the same reasons, it gives you a different flavor for what you do when you have to be in conflict with people. And then finally, from a Buddhist perspective, the root of all the other poisons is ignorance. Ignorance is that tendency to ignore that which we don't see as being of either benefit or harm. And when I give this talk for college kids, I'll often say, everybody who's married, raise their hand. And, one or two hands will go up. And I'll say, okay, does anybody here have the job they're going to do for the rest of their life? And, usually no hands go up. And I say, do you realize that if you're not married, and you don't have the career you're going to do for the rest of your life, that you could walk by the person that you're going to spend your life with on the street and you wouldn't give them a second thought? You'd walk by your mentor, your boss, somebody that's going to make your career or somebody who's going to destroy your career, doesn't matter. And you wouldn't think anything else about them. They could die and you'd be like, oh, bummer. People die all the time, right? That's all you need is a thought experiment to realize that although in a pragmatic sense, of course we have to parcel out where we pay our attention, there's something very liberating of recognizing that it's a necessary trick of being a human. It does not reflect the actuality even of our own particular lives. So that's the equanimity piece. Now, the empathy piece is really, in this practice, about developing what Geshe Lobsang calls this heartfelt, deep, wrenching sense of endearment for other people. And in the Tibetan tradition, they say that indifference is the near enemy of equanimity. So the training does this interesting twist at this point. So once you sort of try to get this sense of being less worked up, good, bad, or otherwise, it now reaches in and tries to help people identify their own evolved sort of the places where they naturally have this deep sense of compassion. Your children, your husband, your wife, if you're lucky, right? Your friend. And begin to work with that, and in the beginning to really try to generate those kinds of feelings. There's a little bit of fake it till you make it in the beginning. This is a deep thing in Tibetan Buddhism, this idea that if you visualize the end game, it increases the speed at which you can get there. And so, really, for instance, you look at that picture, it makes you feel a certain way, doesn't it? If you can feel that way and not become depressed, not become anxious, but instead have this sort of steadfast resolution that you're going to do what you can to help that suffering, it begins to get at what we mean by empathy. And there's a sort of famous anecdote that, as far as I know, is true, because I heard it pretty much from the horse's mouth. A very famous researcher in Europe has been doing brain scan studies of advanced Tibetan Buddhist monastics, these guys that spend 20, 30 years in a cave meditating 8, 10 hours a day. And she was studying a very famous Buddhist monk who happens to be a European, and she was putting him in the brain scanner and having him do deep compassion practices. Not this, I mean deep compassion practices, but built around the same ideas. And she got the bright idea, the researcher got the bright idea of pulling the monk out of the scanner at different points during the meditation. Sort of meditationists interrupt us, I guess, right? And so this guy radiates like a Buddha, man. He's right, and smiling, laughing. So at one point she pulls him out and he erupts into sobbing. And she freaks out. She goes, oh my God, what have I done? She runs in there, and here's this guy sobbing. This guy never loses his composure. She said, oh my God, what's going on? And he said, you pulled me out right when I had generated my maximum empathy and compassion, but I had not discharged it yet. And that, I think, gets at this idea that what we're trying to do here is help people really get in touch with these raw, evolved, primal emotions and then work with them and channel them. Right? That's really what the empathy is about. All right, so the brain and the body are not two different things. They are one astounding connection. And we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that what happens in our bodies has a huge impact on our brain. And conversely, that how you think and how you feel can instantly change the functioning of your body. For instance, it turns out that there is a giant spike in sudden cardiac deaths in cities that lose important sporting events. It's been shown 1,000 times. It's a significant... Now, let me ask you, is it men or women who drop dead? What do you think? Right. So, this picture is complex, but what it says is that when the brain is put under stress, it sends out chemicals that turn on the immune system and turn on a process called inflammation. And inflammation is what makes you sick when you've got the flu. It's these chemicals that then, in turn, get back up to your brain and produce depression and sickness. And you could really say that inflammation, to a large degree, seems to be what translates interpersonal conflict and stress into sickness and misery. Stress activates this immune inflammatory system just like a bug does, just like bacteria, just like viruses. How do we know this? Well, you don't need anything more than an empty room and a few props to really show this. So we do these studies where we bring people in, like this young guy here, and draws blood, and he knows he's in for some kind of stress test. And unbeknownst to him, we put him in a wheelchair so he feels infantilized. We wheel him into the room. He sees these three people frowning at him in white coats. And he's told that he has 5 minutes to prepare a speech on why he should be accepted to medical school. And that this is a panel of behavioral experts that will be analyzing his behavior, but try not to let that bother him. And that he'll notice there is a camera. His performance will be recorded for later analysis, but try not to pay attention. More blood is drawn. They leave the room. They come back. They tell him to stand up and start. They stare at him. If he fumbles and falls silent, the guy in the middle who does the talking's got a stopwatch. He just stares at the person for 20 seconds. Please continue. You have more time. If the guy is blah, 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 the chairman, the guy in the middle says, "Are you always this glib for important interviews?" Something like that to really... At the end of the speech, the guy in the middle says to the subject, "Stop. Now we want you to take the number 1087 and subtract by 13s down to 0 as rapidly and as accurately as possible. Please start." 1087, 1000. First mistake, the chairman goes, "Stop, 1087. Stop, don't use your fingers. Stop, don't count out loud. Faster." Right? So you do this, and it's called the Trier social stress test. Blood pressure goes up, heart rate goes up, cortisol goes up. Young people sometimes pass out. We put the microphone back against the wall so they slide instead of tumble. We had a couple of crotchety old-timers try to jump the guy in the middle there. He's actually he's a black belt karate guy, seriously, CIA operative. So it's not usually a problem. But if you do this, this is what you can find. Here's time across the bottom. This is before the stress test. The box is the stress test. We're going to look for an hour and a half afterwards. We're going to look and see what it does to inflammation. Inflammation goes up. That's what we're looking at. And if you look at medically healthy guys that are not depressed, this test doubles their inflammatory levels. And if you keep that level up chronically, it increases your risk of heart attacks by about 400%, diabetes 400%, depression, big predictor of depression. But what was interesting about this study was we also looked at men who were medically healthy but who were depressed and who had been abused or neglected as kids. And look what happens to their inflammation. They respond to this simple little test as if it's like a massive bacterial assault. So, of course, this gave us the idea that maybe the first thing to try out with the CBCT, the cognitive behavioral-based compassion training, would be to see whether or not, if we compared it to a control group, here it was in college students, and it was a health discussion class, could we turn down these inflammatory responses to stress? And we wanted to know whether or not it made a difference whether you practice. So I'm going to show you the data. I'm going to cut how much the kids practiced during this study in half. High group, low group. And interestingly, you see the same thing here. Here's time on the bottom. Here's inflammation going up. And you can see that, in fact, although the CBCT is lower, they're pretty much the same. But interestingly, many of these kids didn't practice at all. They were college students, right? If you divide it by practice time, you see something remarkable. The students who practiced had a massive reduction in their stress response, and they came in the door with lower inflammation. And if you look at their distress, now we're looking at increasing distress before and after that stress test I told you about. Here's the control group, and the students that didn't practice looked just like the controls, and the people that practiced had this remarkable reduction. So their stress went down. I didn't show you this. Their heart rate went down. Their cortisol, stress hormones recovered more rapidly, and they didn't get this inflammatory response. And we know from other studies that how much inflammation you make on that silly test now very powerfully predicts how depressed you're going to be a year later. So this is really very health relevant. How do we think CBCT does this? We don't know, but we have some other findings that I think play into this. So, it turns out that people all around the world have basically the same facial expressions when it comes to these primal expressions. And when they first went to, when Jared Diamond and Paul Ekman and these guys first went to New Guinea, they showed pictures like this to New Guineans who had never seen a white person, and they were able to name those expressions. Although we're much better at naming expressions in our own in-group than we are outsiders, but still, we're pretty good at it. So, for instance, look at that. Is that a man or a woman? It's a woman. Sorry, guys. Okay, look again. Ready? Playful, comforting, irritated, or bored? Playful. Right. Okay. So what do? We gave people like 30 minutes of doing that over and over and over again in a scanner. Then we randomized them to get CBCT or health discussion control group, and we did it again. And we found that the CBCT made the people that got CBCT got much more accurate at very rapidly recognizing facial expressions, and they increased activity in these brain areas that are in the orange here. These are all the areas in the brain that are necessary for reading people's facial expressions, and they're necessary for empathy and for identifying with other people. So, and the more these brain areas went up, the better people did on the task. So we really have this compelling data, this intriguing data at least, that you practice this technique, and if it takes with you especially, it changes how your brain functions. You become more aware of the subtleties. And with that task I showed you, that Trier social stress test, they've done a really cool study showing that if you measure stress hormones in the subject and those panel members in the white coats, they go like this. When the subject's nervous, the panel's nervous, right? It's really stressful to be a jerk, sit there, And I think what's happening is that the CBCT is teaching people to be more. They can see that little movement of ambiguity in the person's face. They begin to realize that these sorts of encounters are not. There's always an opportunity in encounters like this. It's not all bad. It's not. It's just a study. They know they're in a study, but it helps overcome that hardwired sense of I'm being threatened, so I need to turn on my body's danger systems. Now, obviously, it'd be wonderful if we could somehow bring this into the education of children, because we know from now nearly infinite studies that these inflammatory pathways, these stress pathways, and the brain systems with which they communicate are really laid down in early childhood. And fortunately, we've been able to go into this very unique private school in Atlanta, Georgia, called Paideia, and we've done a study in 4th and 5th graders. One class got CBCT, another class got mindfulness. So just, learning to concentrate, learning to be aware of your emotions. And this has not been published yet, it's just come out. We had a number of measures of whether these trainings made the kids less likely to ostracize other people in their class, more likely to have a larger group of friends. And at the beginning here, we're looking at number of friends. The two groups were the same. Mindfulness really helped. People became more open, more friendly toward others. They had more friends, but the CBCT did more. And so it really suggests that if we target the appropriate ages, there might be some real specific benefit to this sort of specific compassion training. And you can indeed do it in little kids. Now, childhood neglect and trauma abuse is a national heartbreak. It's prevalent. Kids that are abused or neglected die on average 10 years sooner than other people. Not widely known, but shown now in a number of studies. Early life adversity activates inflammation, it activates all these chemicals we've been talking about, and it sets you up for depression, anxiety, heart attacks, dementia, cancer, obesity, diabetes. That whole gamish of modern ills are primed and stoked by early adversity. The little beautiful little child, that adversity tells the child, you need to wire your brain and body to respond to the world like it's a dangerous place. So obviously, if we could go in and do something like CBCT in these sorts of contexts, we would predict that it might be especially relevant. And fortunately for us, now about 8 years ago, I was giving a talk, and the Commissioner of Human Resources for the state of Georgia heard it and sort of had this aha and made this powerful commitment to do what she could to bring CBCT into foster care in Georgia, to study it, to see, because she had this sense that they had all sorts of programs coming in from the outside, but if she could give the children tools to work within themselves to cope with their emotions, she thought she'd get more mileage. And these kids were on unbelievable amounts of psychotropic drugs. You wouldn't give a schizophrenic elephant the levels of medications that these poor kids were getting. So eventually, with the help of ARA funding, we were able to do this study in 70 teenage adolescent foster kids down in a bad part of Atlanta. We tried to have pizza parties. We couldn't get pizza delivered down there. The first night, some of the kids brought knives and guns. They formed gangs. They were going to have compassion wars. I mean, it was wild. And it would be worth this whole entire talk to tell you stories about. I will tell you one story that at the end we did exit interviews, and this one huge kid, the interviewer asked him, she said, can you give me an example of how this helped you? And the guy said, yeah. So he said, today this kid got in my face. I got really mad, and I decided I was going to knife him. And then I started thinking, and my equanimity got in the way. Couldn't say equanimity. So I decided to meditate instead. I mean, that was like but of course, being a study, we were able to look at this question of did it affect the brain and the body. We didn't do brain scans, but we looked at that same inflammatory system. And what this slide says is that the more the kids practice that compassion training, from the start to the end of the study, the more their inflammation dropped. And the more they practiced, the more their sense of hopefulness about their life increased. And we saw, some of the things you can't capture in studies. We saw some of these young people really transform, make up with their parents. Amazing stuff. Again, I wish I had time to tell you more anecdotes, but it powerfully impacted Geshe Lobsang and I, and Brooke and Brendan and the people that were really integral to this work. And so we made a commitment to try to really extend this work. And so let me make 3 types of conclusions. Let me make the pragmatic conclusion first, and that is that we have done pretty well over the years in getting government grants. I mean, we've done very well. But the truth of the matter is that the government's been having some trouble lately, in case you've noticed. And it's very difficult to get government funding. And even in the good old days, you never could do it without the help of people giving you startup funds. And so I want to specifically thank here, because it's going out on the internet, a gentleman named Bobby Paul, who was the dean of Emory University, gave us a little bit of money. I mean, just a few $1,000s in the beginning, and that led to this entire thing. I'm standing here tonight because he believed in us. And a woman named Joni Winston has been a huge donor in support of our work at Emory in Atlanta. And we've been extremely fortunate in Arizona that Barry and Janet Lang have been such powerful donors to our work. So I want to thank them, because without those people, you wouldn't be sitting here, I wouldn't be talking about it, and this work wouldn't be coming. If you're interested in this work, and starting out, we really, Starting out in Tucson, we're working to bring CBCT here. We have several people now really trained to be teachers, and we're going to start working with really troubled, traumatized youth, and we also want to start working with cancer survivors. Here's our information. There's a table in the back. Okay, so let me make 2 more general conclusions for the next 10 seconds, and I'm done. Number 1, human beings are fantastic at fighting. Right? We will invest inordinate and stupid amount of resources when we're fired up to fight something. One way to think about what I'm telling you is that if we could divert just a little bit of those resources toward fighting the real enemy, our internal states that produce all this trouble, we would go much further. I suspect we could fairly rapidly make huge progress with just that little bit of a shift. And then I can't help making this comment, such a great poster. And remember, I started in the beginning by saying that we think about happiness as being the pursuit of an I. But in fact, we know that happiness is really about we. So thank you all very much, and thanks for coming. Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Chuck. That was a great talk. As Chuck leaves the stage here, if people have burning questions that they want to answer here or in the lobby, he'll be able to do that. The Arizona Daily Star is running a live chat on Friday from 12 to 1, and Chuck will answer your questions as they're submitted. And the last thing I want to say is that Dr. Esther Sternberg is here with us tonight from the Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine, and her talk is next Wednesday, and we hope to see you all there. It's on place and the built environment and happiness. Thanks very much.
Good. Thanks.